Good evening and a very warm welcome to all our viewers. My name is Samantha Castle and I'm the Senior Manager for Alumni Relations at the University of Pretoria. If you were able to join us on Tuesday for our pre-budget discussion, you would have heard our panel of experts have a very robust discussion on the state of our economy. In this evening's discussion, our experts will examine and expand upon the key interventions announced by the Minister of Finance yesterday. This discussion is part of the Lead UP Alumni Thought Leadership Series, and it's brought to you by the Alumni Relations Office and Brand SA. Dr. Morris Mtumbini, who is our interim dean of our Gibbs Business School, will be our moderator this evening. I thank you all for tuning in and for always supporting your alma mater, and also for continuing to share your own opinions and views with us. Now, without any further ado, allow me to introduce our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Tawana Kupe, to say a few words. Over to you, Prof. Kupe.
Thank you, Samantha, Senior Manager, Alumni Relations, and thank you for your division for mounting these debates. Good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome. It's a day or so after the supplementary budget by the Minister of Finance, so we need to do some debating. But first, let me just assure our alumni, our esteemed guests, some of who are not necessarily alumni, but are friends of UP, our associates, and some on this panel tonight will end up joining our academic staff to become professors in these things. Thank you very much for in advance for joining the university. A few things about the university to our alumni, our friends, our associates, our esteemed guests. The University of Pretoria is increasingly raising the bar in its quality and excellence of its programs. It is in the top 1.9% in the world, where there are 26,000 universities. And then we're celebrating some fine moments this year. Gibbs, our leading business school, number 38 in the world for executive education, turns only 20 this year, but leads the pack in South Africa and leads the pack in Africa. Then two faculties, the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, we're talking economics today, turns 100 this year. Our Faculty of Veterinary Science, the only Faculty of Veterinary Science in South Africa and the second one in Southern Africa, also turns 100 years this year. We also are the top producer and the leading accounting school in South Africa for the last 3 or more years. And also we are the top producer of research in South Africa, and also the university with the largest number of academic staff with PhDs. There are many PhDs on the panel tonight. Our PhD percentage to 69%. As of this year, the national average is 48%. We also have launched 4 new exciting innovation platforms. Innovation platforms designed to produce research that matters to solving complex, complicated, and intersectional issues, like creating a new economy and a new society in the wake of massive disruptions. We're living in the age of major disruptions: technological disruption, pandemics, anemic economic growth, and economic wastelands, as the minister clearly pointed out last year. At UP, we have 4 new innovation platforms recently constructed: Future Africa Institute, Engineering 4.0, all things digital in transport; Innovation Africa, all things digital, precision, sustainable agriculture; and a new museum that also uses a range of digital technologies. You can catch it on Instagram as well. We're ready as the University of Pretoria to contribute to creating a new economy and to creating a new society. And so what we're looking for tonight is, Vice Chancellor, I want to hear what concretely are we going to do to construct a new economy that addresses the complex, complicated, intersectional problems of youth unemployment, unemployment in general, inequality, poverty, and also recreating a just, equitable, equal economy that delivers on social justice and that also is a pillar for creating a new society: democratic, prosperous, sustainable, and a Texas place among the nations of the world that lead. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have an esteemed panel, and thank you again to the panel. And I'll hand over back, and now let's hear cutting-edge debate from the Cutting Edge University.
Thank you, Prof. Cooper. And we look forward to some of these recommendations from our panelists. Don't forget to join us for our next Lead UP Alumni virtual chat, which will happen on the 8th of July from 5 to 6 p.m. And the alumni from across the continent will focus on the topic global lockdowns, learning, thriving, or just surviving. We hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion with us, and please feel free to drop your comments in our live feed. Over to you, Dr. Mtombeni.
Thank you, Sam. Good evening, everyone. As you can see, my name is Morris Mtombeni, Interim Dean-elect at Gibbs. I'm joined this evening for a really important conversation, especially following a somber presentation by the Minister of Finance yesterday afternoon. Allow me to go straight into introducing my panel of fellow panelists, speakers, to this conversation about what's next as we navigate this COVID-19 pandemic that we're going to live with for the foreseeable future. So I'll begin by introducing somebody who wasn't able to join us on Tuesday, investor and entrepreneur, somebody who might be well known to many of you, Mr. Andile Kumar. Good evening, Andile.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And then, of course, our agent provocateur from Tuesday, from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, Mr. Duma Bule.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, and you're welcome again. Thanks for coming back. I'm sure you're gonna give us a run for our money, so to speak. And joining him, one of our hosts and sponsors for this evening from Brand SA, Dr. Petrus. Please join us, Petrus. Petrus de Kock.
Evening, Morris. Evening, Duma Adile.
And, they say economists, you always start on the one hand and then on the other. So on the one hand, I'd like to introduce my colleague from the Gordon Institute of Business Science, Professor Adrian Seville.
Evening, Morris. Evening, everyone.
Welcome back, Adrian. And finally, the smartest among us, and none other than Dr. Tabi Leok.
Evening, everyone.
Lovely. Before we kick off our conversation, I'd like to encourage, our colleagues and our viewers and participants to please go onto Slido and remember slido.com and remember to enter the event code LeadUp, LeadUP, hashtag LeadUP 23 June. Is that right? Would it be 23 June or 25 June? I think it should be 25 June personally. So put up LeadUp 25 June and answer, give us an indication of the poll that is running there. And the topic is, which topic would you most like to learn more about? The first one is South African economic stimulus and the recovery plan. Oh, don't we need to know more about that one? Sovereign credit ratings, factors contributing to unemployment, as well as sovereign wealth funds. If only we could have more of those, or would you like to know all of the above? So I'd like to kick off maybe with a soft question about what was our key takeout from Minister Tito Mbowene's budget, supplementary budget speech yesterday, and possibly kick off in the order in which I introduce people. Let's start with you, Andile.
And you have to start with the one guy who doesn't have a PhD or is not a doctor here. I feel surrounded by very intelligent people, but nonetheless, thank you so much, Doc, for the introduction.
You know what they say about PhDs?
What do they say?
We know a lot about very little. So, so please do not be intimidated. Chances
not at all.
You know a lot about many things, whereas we know a lot about very little. So,
okay. I hope that makes Duma and I feel really good. Absolutely. But nonetheless, good evening, everybody. My take as a good evening to the colleagues. I'm blessed to know all of you personally. I'm happy to be here with you. My key takeout was probably more about how he said everything and less about what he said. I don't think there was too many surprises about what he said, and maybe some of the indicative numbers really just proved what we already knew. But his entire delivery on the day just sounded like a leader who was pretty much saying, guys, you know what? I've tried, we've all tried, but essentially we are in a big heap of trouble as a country. We have lived beyond our means. There was a time this family could afford to live a certain lifestyle. Mom and dad have had a salary cut. In fact, perhaps one of them have lost a job. There's no more income coming anyway time soon. And instead, you kids and the rest of the family have increased spend, and all your spend has gone into food and kind of paying life expenses. You've invested nothing. And now here we are as a family, we are broke. There's nothing coming in kind of the near future. And this is the trouble we're in. The only way we're going to survive is go to the bank or to the neighbors and let them borrow us some money so that we can have food on the table every day. And, and we're going to live like that for a long, long time until hopefully one day, mom and dad get back to work or get a better salary increase and there's more productivity out there and we can all live better again. So it was just kind of a hard truth. I think we all kind of knew it. I mean, when he was mentioning the GDP numbers at the beginning about how the global growth numbers have moved from what was thought to be 3.3% growth at the time to a 5% contraction. And then he mentioned our numbers that we all know was pretty much no growth to what he's forecasting to be below 7% of a contraction, which I think is going to be much more, by the way. So you can see that the message there is that we were already in trouble. Our country was already in a tough place relative to the world.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have this entrepreneur, Duma, who feels we're in trouble and even in more trouble than the minister says we are. Do you agree with this, Duma?
Yes, we are in deep trouble. But I just want to say something, that a national budget does not operate like a household budget or a company budget, because the country, the sovereign, can issue its own currency. So what my takeaway from this budget was how little the contribution from the fiscus is and how little the contribution from the central bank is. So starting with the central bank today, this morning, our inflation went down to 3%. And as we knew, we are in the most deflationary shock in our country's history. There is still lots of space to cut interest rates, number one. Number two, there's so many other instruments. We talk about imagination, but we are not using imagination. The US Fed has got 11 lending lines to support the economy worth $2.3 trillion. So basically in South Africa, if we had a proper central bank, it would be backstopping many parts of our society. So number one, I would say the central bank can step in and buy bonds on the secondary market. We're going to be 760 billion rands. They should step in with the Public Investment Corporation and buy some of those bonds to tame the bond market. Elsewhere in the world, bond markets have been effectively nationalized. Number two, they can buy bonds on the primary market where new issues of bonds are made. Number three, they can recapitalize development finance institutions, productive investment, monetary financing. And number four, they can provide monetary financing of government expenditure. Now coming back to the other issue I want to talk about, which I didn't explain properly yesterday, is that I'm reading the statements from the Budget Justice Coalition and AIDC, some of the organizations that serve civil society. On the fiscal policy side, there was new spending of 36 billion rand. That is 0.7% of GDP. So we're sitting on the one side with 275 basis points cuts in interest rates and 36 billion rands of new spending. Now, that would not have been enough for the crisis before the crisis, when we had two recessions in 2 consecutive years, and we're heading for the third recession in 3 consecutive years. So I'm just gobsmacked about the lack of a response from both sides of our monetary and fiscal policy side. And finally, I just wanted to say, we've got this vast balance sheet as a country. We've got 922 billion rands in foreign exchange reserves. That is 8 months of imports, and the benchmark is 3 months. Why can't we release some of those reserves into the economy to support the economy? The second issue I want to talk about is the Public Investment Corporation. It is 100% funded. The majority of government pension funds in the whole world are not fully funded. We cannot afford the luxury of a fully funded pension fund. And there is means for us, and I was really happy that the Budget Justice Coalition, all the civil society organizations are in. I work with all the trade unions, SAFTU, COSATU. They're all for the Public Investment Corporation making a role in terms of solving the situation that we're in. And I believe we can reduce the funding in the Public Investment Corporation. I'm just looking at something. This thing generates surpluses of 50 billion rands a year.
We got you.
Yeah.
Petrus, so we have an unhappy entrepreneur. We've got the activists who has these amazing ideas. I think he gave us 5 different action points that even if our Minister of Finance had taken one of them, perhaps he would have excited the population, but did not even touch on any of this. Do you think Duma knows something that the Minister of Finance doesn't? Or are we just stubbornly holding on to a philosophical approach that has long passed its due date?
Yeah, maybe just a quick comment on what Duma said. It's not so straightforward for a reserve bank, for example, to step into an economy and start buying bonds directly. The reason the Federal Reserve can do that, and that it has those 11 lines where it buys bonds and junk, by the way, to protect the US economy, is because it sits at the core of the global financial system. The dollar backs a big chunk of the global economy. So that reserve has a very different capability to what the South African Reserve Bank has. So I think we must not make it sound so easy. The Reserve Bank can just step in and do X, Y, Z. I don't think it's that straightforward. But 3 things that stand out to me from the budget speech, I think it kind of comes to me in 3 words. We were discussing it before the session. The first one is debt. I think the minister was very honest with us as South Africans. It's like Andile said at the beginning, and I like your analogy actually of a household. And that's how we must translate it, to ourselves, because each and every household in this country is already feeling the pinch. There's a family member, a person somewhere who's not only suffering from COVID, who gets the virus, but also households that are being affected. So that's the real picture we're facing here. The second one is zero. And the word zero is related to what the minister said, which I think is very important, zero-based budgeting moving forward in the next MTSF. Now, that could potentially change the ballgame quite significantly in terms of state expenditure, depending on how the administration adopts or implements that in the context of the 6th administration. And the last one is reform. I think once again, the minister concluded, and I think in the last paragraphs there, he refers back to the discussion document from last year. I know there's still a lot of debate out there. However, I think that still gives us a continuity of thinking, number one. There's an acknowledgement of the depth of the crisis we're in, and Dele, also what you referred to earlier. In February budget speech, global growth was expected to be 3.3%. In June now, it's dropped to a contraction of 5.3%. It's like a black hole opened in the global economy. So this disaster, there's no formula to answer this. And I think that's where, I think some of our thinking, and I love any form of engagement, because as South Africans, we have to engage and understand these things and criticize where necessary. But ultimately, what's the solution? How do we move forward? And I think that's what people are shouting for.
Thank you, Petrus. Adrian. So I'm concerned about how we come across to the man in the street. How does this budget make sense to the man of the street? And so we're hearing about this household that is in a bit of trouble on the one hand, but we're hearing also that a government budget is not like a company budget or a family budget. So how then should we make sense of this? So I wonder if you can kind of try and bring this home to us to say, should we be worried, or is there a light at the end of this tunnel, no matter how far this light is?
Morris, so yesterday we were introduced to the hippopotamus. I'm going to bring another animal into the picture. I'm going to bring the crocodile into the story. And crocodiles have some of the most powerful jaws in the animal kingdom. They grab their prey, they crush down on their prey, and they generally don't kill large prey on impact. Instead, they take the prey into the water and they perform what is called a death roll, where they disorient their prey and then they take their prey down underwater and drown them. That's the way the crocodile kills large prey. And I think South Africa has taken itself into that environment. And it's not that this was done to us. You know, there's lots of hand-wringing when it's referencing the ratings agencies and their very poor timing about downgrading us as we went into COVID-19. We'd been warned and cautioned and flagged and given red lights and orange lights and told to come out of the water, and we just kept pushing in. So if we're going to stay with a family analogy, this would be the equivalent to my mom and my dad giving me lots and lots of really good advice and warnings, and me telling them that I know better and that somehow the rules for me are different. The rules for South Africa are not different. If you borrow money, you have to pay it back. If you borrow money to fund state-owned enterprises, civil servant salaries, you want to make sure that there is a return on that investment, and so that it's clear that I'm not some red-hearted capitalist. Social return on investment, not necessarily capital return on investment. But South Africa's social and capital return on investment is way below our cost of funding. And so we've taken ourselves into a financial territory that is quite simply unsustainable, and it will take us into bankruptcy. So we have to reimagine. Duma's absolutely right. We have to reimagine. We have to think of new ways of doing this. From our Tuesday night conversation that I am far more cautious and conservative when it comes to talking about the Reserve Bank. There are creative ways we can do this. One of the things that you don't want to ever do is compromise your institutions. Yeah. South Africa's gone down that slope in other forms, and we know that pulling compromised institutions back is a very, very difficult task. Our Reserve Bank and our National Treasury are two of the most respected financial organs globally. We don't want to compromise that.
Thank you. Tabi, so we have, we are accused of being a manel, so thank you for being on the panel so it doesn't feel like a manel. We've got 3 of our 4 male panelists feeling quite down and out, and I'm so glad Petrus is around, who's saying, hang on guys, things are bad, but there's some positive stuff coming out there. So I don't know where you're gonna sit, because I found that you're quite pragmatic about these things. Is there any hope, Tabi?
The president and the finance minister have described this pandemic as a war. This analogy has been made by other world leaders. And, after the supplementary budget, I'm convinced that I would not want to go to war with the president and the minister as my war buddies or my soldiers, because I know that they will not bring the right ammunition to fight the enemy. So I was thoroughly underwhelmed by the supplementary budget. So the one thing, let me just Reserve Bank out of, I know I won't succeed because I've been trying to do this for, I think, over 5 years. But I want to, again, tell this to Duma and to the listeners that the Reserve Bank is sacrosanct. The Reserve Bank is doing its role, and it's doing its role quite well, its job quite well. Monetary policy doesn't lead fiscal policy, or else it doesn't work. Fiscal policy leads monetary policy. and we've seen it in the way the monetary policy has operated. Central bank, the Reserve Bank can cut interest rates to zero tomorrow. It will not impact the people who live across from me, across from the highway in Alexandra. It will not impact most of South Africa. And that's because, people are unemployed. And the fact that interest rates are low, it'll impact people like me and everyone else on this webinar, because you'll receive a text message from your bank to tell you that you can actually get a loan for less, and also any debt that you have with the bank is now less than it was previously. So again, it benefits those who are leveraged, and it benefits corporates, but not the majority of South Africans. When the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates, and many people think of interest rates only in terms of the short end of the curve. And I want to explain how interest rates work. Interest rates are not just what the bank tells you, and it's just not passed through into just food prices. Interest rates includes also it's a money market instrument. So we have the long end and the short end of the curve, and it also impacts on the debt because it impacts on the yields and the debt repayments. When we cut our CPI by 275 basis points, it did nothing to the economy. It didn't do anything. It benefited a few, but also in terms of the bond yields, they actually spiked. So the cost of borrowing increased, despite the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates. And that's because there's one element that many people do not consider in this whole discussion, is that investors invest in South Africa. Investors have a say. So when you cut interest rates and investors are still not convinced by your country and they think that you're going to default, they're not going to invest in the long end of the curve. They're going to stay in the short end of the curve, and they'll want higher yields for their exposure to their country, and that's what investors are saying. And so the only time when actually yields started falling back is when we did the bond purchasing, but we can't do that continuously because it has implications. So that's why I think that the problem is not with the Reserve Bank. The problem is with fiscal policy. So I left after listening to the minister and after reading the whole 109 pages, I think, of the supplementary budget, I realized that I still don't know what our fiscal policy is, because in other aspects, they're trying to consolidate, as in cutting expenditure. But in other aspects of it, they're increasing expenditure. So in a crisis, typically you spend more to get your way out of a crisis. And you have to spend in the right places as well. We are not spending in the right places. So we increased our consolidated expenditure. So our budget has increased. So which means that we're expending, it expended actually very little. So Duma's right in that it's not enough. But at the same time, where they need to cut, where I think they should cut, let's say, government wages, for instance. If you cut 15% of government wages, you raise almost 180 billion rands. People will argue, and unions will argue, that cutting wages means that you're going to slow growth. The Reserve and the Treasury, National Treasury, told us in February that the biggest burden on the fiscus is the wage bill. So, and also it told us that despite it being one of the biggest, so over a third of our expenditure goes to wages, but government productivity, so the correlation between wages and productivity is low. So those who are getting all these lofty salaries from our taxes are not actually being productive. So why are we continuing to throw money at a very unproductive or relatively unproductive side or sector in the budget, whereas we can actually cut a part of it and allocate it in an area where we can get that economic multiplier effect that will generate the necessary growth that we need during a recession. So I think that, again, we do have a budget. We're not allocating it properly.
Thank you. So I can see that we are an underwhelmed panel. And whilst we're reflecting on that, I'm going to ask each of you to think about a question, and maybe as a kickoff, if you put on your own personal perspective, Andile as an entrepreneur, Duma as a research and advisor, and so forth, about if you were to zone in on a specific part of the budget that you would still like to influence going forward so that we can give hope, right? So just think about a specific part of the budget that you would like to influence that you think can give hope. In the meantime, whilst we're doing that, let me give you the results of the first poll. So 44% of the viewers, listeners, followers, whatever we call them, want to know more about the stimulus and recovery plan of the South African economy. 40% want to discuss more about the factors that are contributing to unemployment and how we can turn this around. And 28% doesn't seem right. 44, 28, let's go with that for the moment. 28%. Now, the numbers don't look right, Adrian. 28% want to do sovereign wealth. Maybe there's double counting somewhere there, and the balance sovereign credit
There's a
rating.
fiscus that's looking for you.
Yeah, there is Dumas people that are
That's more than 100.
Oh, I was told you can vote more than once. Okay, thank you so much. That was helpful. My Bantu education from Leresha Combined School kicked in there, and I thought, no, 44 plus 40 plus 28 is already over 100%, Chief. So I'm okay. Back at you. So Andile, before we kick off, we're gonna kick off with the second poll, also on Slido, and it's hashtag lead UP 25 June. And we'd say, would you like to learn more about the government's response to COVID-19 pandemic and how this will affect individuals and businesses in particular? So today we're speaking more about the macro view. There will be more sessions on in the individual and business effect. So maybe on that, let me kick back at you, Andile. If you were to focus on one thing in the government's response, not what it should have been, but what it is, that you would like to influence to enable us to give hope to South Africa, what would that be?
Morris, it's simple for me because I guess I live in the real world outside of the academic debates. What do we have? We have a country of human beings who are trying to live. We're trying to get up every day and an honest day's work or wages and go back and feed their families. And they hope for basic services to work, and they hope to grow old, have kids, and die. We want to live safely, and we want to live securely. So the things that bother me the most is how do we create an environment for people to have decent livelihoods? And as one of your panelists here, Dr. Adrian Seville, once told me, one, there's no silver bullet to most problems. But if business people could hope for anything, that would be economic growth. So for me, I think this conversation should be about how can we get the economy started? How can we get it going? How can we support the businesses we already have that are already employing the people that are employed? How do we get them going? And the damn squib for me was the presentation, once again, of the loan guarantee scheme, which actually, as we all know, is not really a loan guarantee scheme, because we call it that, but then the banks are required to apply the same kind of terms in lending to these small businesses that they typically do anyway. And right up on top of the list is a personal surety. Why the hell do you have a guarantee scheme that still asks for a guarantee? I don't get that. Number two, the scheme itself seems to be very focused on paying the bills you would have incurred during, let's call it, the 3 months of lockdown. Makes no sense to me again. So I must borrow money from the bank to pay my landlord. I must borrow money from the bank to pay staff. I must borrow money to pay all the bills that I incurred when I couldn't trade. Sounds to me that whoever came up with this stuff didn't talk to real entrepreneurs and real business people. What we need, and the thing I would wish I could influence, is real, because I really do agree with Tabi. I think the funds and the budgets are there. Where do we allocate them to get the economy going? For me, it's about helping existing businesses, particularly the more small and medium-sized, in order for them to find a way to survive and therefore thrive in what is now our new normal. Yes, they have to resolve what has happened in the past 3 months. But for me, that's almost less important than what happens in the next 3 months, next 3 years of operating a business in this environment. So, and maybe this was not the time to get into details, maybe it's still coming in the medium-term budget policy statement, but something has to give that can actually make a difference to business.
Well, I suppose we could immediately say, we know you're listening, Minister. We know you like to tweet like the other guy with funny hairstyle in the US. And tell us, can you restructure the loan guarantee scheme immediately? Because that could be something that changes your world tomorrow, right? At the very least. So if you committed to the loan guarantee scheme, make it work. Because you told us that they already have guaranteed about 10 billion rands worth of loans, and it's picking up steam. Yeah.
But Morris, that's fundamentally the problem. The problem is that we've wasted time coming up with something that was stillborn from day one. All you had to do is just ask the right people that could have told you. Now he's announcing, of course, in the budget speech like he did, that no, they're reviewing it now. Only now because they can see it doesn't work. They came up with 200 billion. Then they said, no, we'll give you 100 billion to see how it's going. And the banks the other day announced that they only lent 7 billion. I could have told you over a cup of tea it wasn't going to work. Now we've wasted all this time coming up with the thing. Now we're reviewing it again. Just do it right the first time around.
Just answer your phone. The minister will call you shortly. Duma?
Yeah,
what is your one thing? Your one thing, Duma, not 5 things, one thing.
Okay, one thing. I think my problem is that Treasury is unaccountable to anybody. It has an effective veto over any economic policy that may be decided through democratic means. I'll give you an example. In September 2018, the government and the president said we want a 400 billion rand infrastructure fund. Treasury cancelled it, yeah. In April, the president again says 100 billion rands for job creation and SME development. Treasury has effectively cancelled it, yeah. It's nowhere to be seen anywhere in the budget. That is part of the 100 billion rands, the 500 billion rands alleged stimulus. So for me, if I read this budget, every single budget for the past decade is exactly the same. It's a cut and paste, no different from the last one. Let me explain what I'm talking about. So every year for the past 10 years, they've got the GDP growth forecast wrong. And the reason for that is that the austerity started about 5 years ago, but let's leave that aside. The point is what they do, fiscal consolidation, then structural reforms, and they overestimate the growth enhancing impact of those structural reforms. So they've done that again in the supplementary budget. So they've got 2 scenarios. One takes us to 140% of GDP, and one, they stabilize the debt. But that one as well, it's based on these structural reforms delivering growth. But everywhere you read about these structural reforms, the IMF, the Treasury's own paper explain that structural reforms do not deliver growth in the short term. They will not get us out of the situation that we're in right now. And right now, our problem is a collapse of aggregate demand. And quite frankly, I don't understand why you're talking about structural reforms when we've just had an earthquake and we have to rebuild our country. It makes no sense whatsoever. Some of them, we need them, yes, of course. I can't against it. But right now, that's not the main priority as a country. We have to stimulate aggregate demand. We have to get our country, we have to have a humanitarian response, and those are the things that we need to do. And I don't understand why they're banging at this structural reform for 10 years. It has never delivered the growth that they expected. And why are they doing this in the middle of a bloody crisis? I don't get it. Yeah.
I think, Petrus, we need to give Duma a chance to breathe. He's going to burst a vein there, He's angry. He says when
are these structural reforms ever going to be? Every single budget for 10 years. And then what they're going to say now is that, no, you haven't implemented them well enough. Try them harder. Try them harder. The doctor's giving you the same medicine and then tried harder. And 10% GDP collapse, and you want your structural reforms. How the Treasury's own document says they're not going to deliver growth. So why should we do that? Yeah.
So, Petrus, your guys are not accountable. They miss their own targets. They contradict themselves. Duma is saying, be accountable, say what you're going to do, back up your president, don't veto your president. Do you agree? What view do you see here?
Man, I'm going to take a bit of a different approach here. Maybe it's also, I'm a TIX alumni, and I studied political science there. I think we are not just as South Africa, but as a world, we are being confronted with a very new and a very old question at the same time, which is the role of the state in relation to economic activity and society. There's a major, it sounds like I'm now suddenly raising a major philosophical question here, but it's a very practical thing. Duma's comments, Andile's comments, Tabi's comments earlier, may have very specific views on the budget, but remember there's a much more fundamental issue at stake here. Firstly, all of our activities, whether we're at a university or in a business or whatever, if we believe in the project called the Republic of South Africa, our activities should ideally be directed in such a way that we aim to achieve collective objectives. Okay, so now the philosophy is over and I'm going to become very practical in some of my comments. I want to go back to what I said on Tuesday. Yes, there's a major debate to be had about allocation of monies, policy implementation, challenges, etc., etc. But I'm going to stand firm on the point that there's capability and resources in this country for us at this point in time to step in very significant ways. For example, I referred to this right at the end on Tuesday, and I made a point. I want to raise it again today. Our historical project of land reform. We know we have an incredibly painful history as a country, but I think we stand to lose a tremendous historical opportunity now as we speak in the midst of a pandemic. If we do not look at ourselves as business people, as people in particular communities, asking ourselves the question, what resources do I have at my disposal to spark activity in a particular area, in a particular sector? So coming back to the philosophical question then really we need to be very realistic about what is the capability of the state from a financial point of view and what is the capability of society and where do we match these things. Let me just throw in another practical, quick final example of a possibility where we need to be looking into. In this administration, the district development model has been coming into the table. Not a lot of public debate on that, but it's taking shape in the administration. And I'm just putting it on the table. There's thinking, there's systems, there's structures that we can still use to our benefit that's still stronger than what we think it is. So I'm not saying we're living in some kind of utopia or that I see the sky with pink-colored flowers floating around all day long. I'm not like that. I'm a very realistic person. And I'm saying to you, in as much as we may be facing a major crisis, I also think by obsessing about everything that we think is wrong, we're also not spending that same time thinking about what's the opportunities out there. And really, I think we lose a lot of time by just hot air the whole time about everything that's wrong, and we never come to the table. For example, I've raised a very practical question a few weeks ago in a debate on SFM with trade union leaders, where I asked the question, what is the role? Unions have a very particular view on economics, etc. But the resources at the disposal of trade union federations in this country, pools of monies floating around there, what's that money doing to go in and develop communities? That's a question that I have, for example. So what I'm trying to say is I'm not criticizing unions or anybody. What I'm trying to say is we must really look in the mirror then and say, what is the resources that our institutions have at its disposal? How do we rethink? How do we deploy that resource in society to spark growth? And that is what we need to be thinking about now.
Thank you so much, Petrus. Adrian, I see Petrus is trying to get us out of a dystopia. Are you going to take us back into the dystopia, or are you moving it towards utopia? Is there any hope for us, Adrian?
Well, yes, there is hope for us. And I'm going to give you, a first message of hope. As many of the examples that, we point to as country miracles, countries that have transformed extraordinarily, many of them are born in crisis. What is unusual about this moment is that it's collective crisis, that we are not in this alone. But you could think of, the end of World War II as an example, or the collapse of the Berlin Wall as another example, where crisis was sprung upon people, many countries as a collective. And the elegance of that, the beauty, the gift in that is we don't have to learn, and we're not in this alone. We don't have to learn. We don't have to do this as doe-eyed. We can learn from others, and we can borrow from those models and experiences. What did they do that we can bring here to help us cope with crisis and recover spectacularly. And there's country after country. And the reference to land reform, for instance, there's some fantastic work done on Asian economies to understand why some Asian economies have stuttered and stumbled and others have been born into spectacular circumstances. And they've got common ingredients. One of the common ingredients is the superstars, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, all start with agriculture as a backbone. South Africa keeps walking straight past this incredible resource that we sit on, and that has been the source of abuse in this country historically. So, if I could point to that as a first aspect, we can borrow from others, use this crisis as an opportunity to reset and reinvent. The second point that I'd make with reference to the budget is recognize that the deficit is not only fiscal, that the deficit is in delivery and the deficit is in confidence. And when I talk about confidence, we are expert generally in talking about South Africa in blaming one party, and that is government. The other aspect that the Asian miracles show us is that there is not a single Asian country that has become successful. There's not a single country that's become successful without a powerful collaboration between public and private. The state cannot do this on its own, and the private sector is not the source of wonderful miracles. For every state-owned enterprise failure, I can name for you a private sector failure. This has to be done as a cohesive, as a collaboration. And the third, very quickly to Tully's point, is she says, she talks about the allocation of money. I'm going to argue that we've got enough money. We are spending it in the right places, but we are spending it poorly. We have to emphasize delivery and we have to emphasize accountability.
Lovely. Thank you. Tabi, on the one hand, you are getting support, on the other, you're getting kicked while you're down. Do you have any hope, or do you want to take your fellow economists back whilst you recover?
So I do sympathize with Duma and his anger, because it does get frustrating that with each year we see the same thing and we hope for a different outcome, and then the budget under delivers. And he is right in that we've been kicking the can down the road, that our estimates have been wrong all the time. And I think that's why the minister wanted to introduce the zero-based budgeting model, because of this multi-year budgeting process where there are estimates every 3 years and budgets are allocated as, with a 3-year cycle, and there's under delivery in that 3-year cycle. So I am the frustrated economist. I do still think that we are not allocating properly, because we're allocating towards consumption. We should be allocating our fiscus towards investment that would lead to sustained long-term growth. When the minister mentioned this whole zero-based budgeting model, I thought to myself, firstly, he must model it, the Treasury must model it first to see whether it can be successful, because I suspect that it won't. And that's because a large portion of our expenditure has become autonomous. How do you move around grants? How do you move around wages? How do you move around free education? Or imagine if we added NHI, and then you're trying now to allocate differently when you have already set allocations in wages, set allocations in grants, set allocation in free education, etc. The other thing is that infrastructure investment, we talk about it as an enabler of sustainable growth, which it is, but you can't implement infrastructure projects on a 1-year basis. Infrastructure projects are multi-year. So again, it makes it very difficult to then throw in the zero-based budgeting when you've got where it's a 1-year motivation that ministers have to make to Treasury in order for them to get their expenditure, whereas, infrastructure is a multi-year project. We have multi-year expenditure plans. So those things that, frustrate me, and Duma's, mentioned stimulating aggregate demand. And that's where, again, I emphasize, you need to, if part of you're looking at the budget expenditure and you're thinking there's actually very few places where you can move things around before you can start borrowing. Wages, cut wages, allocate those to where you can stimulate aggregate demand. And I would even suggest what Andile said, if we are to raise, let's say, if you cut 15% of government wages and that raises 180 billion rand, take that and put it into small enterprises, the informal sector. The rest of it, give checks to people. Give 2,000 Rand for the next 3 months to South Africans who've lost their jobs and poor South Africans. That's one way of stimulating growth, because people will then start consuming. But when you're starting to play around and you're basically kicking the can around and you're not actually fixing the problems, then you're not going to stimulate aggregate demand. And we're going to, at the 3 months time in September, October, at the MTBPS, we'll be sitting here having the same discussion and being equally frustrated. So I think that there are obvious things that need to be done. There are difficult decisions that need to be made. I don't think you can workshop your way out of a crisis. You cannot also, no military head in any country in a war is going to ask his enemies around for a consensual view so that he can fight the other enemy. And that's our main problem, that you're busy asking, hey, labor, union, business, and then everybody's confusing you and you're trying to be a leader to fight a war, and you're not going to decide. You're the leader, you're voted, decide on what needs to be done and make that decision. Or else we're just going to be all over the place like we are now.
Lovely. We're screaming for more leadership. So, colleagues, we have 7 minutes left. And I'm just going to throw one question at a time to you. So a question from the viewers, as well as your final comments. So Andile, I'm going to start with you. This is from Kaya. What are your thoughts on the business restart option that the minister announced? Do you think it will go somewhere towards resuscitating our businesses? Use that as a closing remark.
Short answer, no. Long answer, we need to start finding the opportunities, as Petrus has already said. I think the opportunity we have now is that for the first time in a long time, everyone is in the same bowl. We're all in the same pot here. The whole world is going through this pandemic. We were underperforming the rest of the world. Now everyone is pretty much in the doldrums, maybe us worse than others. But the beauty of that is that we are suddenly no longer the only ugly kid here. We are all unattractive. And what that means is that we can all try and rise out of it. And for me, the opportunity is digital skills, digital jobs. I don't know if anybody saw the headline. I don't know how you would have missed it. Amazon announced 3,000 jobs in South Africa. 3,000. I don't know when's the last time I saw a company announce creating jobs. That gives you a sign. That tells you where the world is going. So for me, that is the single biggest opportunity we've got.
Lovely. Thank you, Duma. For you, also Kaya, he says, for the first time ever, we are looking to spend 2 trillion as part of our fiscal framework. Should we be spending this much when our debt ratio is so high? Use that as a closing remark, 60 seconds.
Okay, quickly, our debt ratio is 80%, but every single country in the world is going to have an increase in their debt to GDP ratio of 10 to 15% percentage points. And as Andile said, everybody's in the same boat. So on a relative to our peers, we won't be different. So that is what. And then the second thing I want to say is that when it's like this chaos, we can do whatever. I don't know what to say, man. Sorry. And then just last point, I want to do a scenario. Is that, okay. A scenario, and the IMF chief economist, she was saying that you've got 2 options: do nothing, which is what we are doing, or spend on the fiscal stimulus. And if you do the numbers, because most of the increase in the debt is because of the tanking economy. So if you spend the appropriate amount, you might end up better than if you had not spent the amount. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what you were saying.
Spend yourself out of trouble. Thank you so much for that. Petrus, one of the viewers, Liacho, says Dr. P is spot on regarding unions. Where do they fit in as part of the solution? Because they are sitting on resources. It is time they step up. You want to conclude with that? You've already started talking about that. Would you want to conclude about part of the solution?
I think maybe maybe just briefly on that point. I do think there's incredible resources in South Africa. We must all as institutions look maybe very differently at what we have at our disposal, whether you're a federation, whether you a stokvel company, whatever you are. I think we must look very different at our resources. Maybe just to conclude with, and just on the theme of UP alumni talks, I did my master's at UP on a man called Murray Bookchin. And as I was preparing for the session today, he wrote about social ecology. And it's all about balance. It's about balancing human behavior with nature, with culture. And I think as a humanity, yes, we are being challenged as an economy, but as a humanity, I think this pandemic is also pushing us in certain directions in terms of climate change. How do we behave? How do we produce? How do we consume? And how do we share the spoils of economic activity? And that's, I think, a very big, and I think a much more fundamental thing we'll have to grasp in the coming years.
Lovely. Thank you. By the way, I forgot to give you the results of the second poll. The results of that poll were 88% would like to learn more about how to respond to the pandemic at an individual and business level. So, Andile, they may well call you back because you've got strong views in that regard. So I hope I haven't kind of made it path dependent for Sam, but nonetheless, I think you'd give very good insight. Adrian, for you to close out in 60 seconds or less, a quick question for you from Anonymous. Treasury is looking to borrow $4.2 billion from the IMF, but they seem to be struggling to agree on terms of the loan. What do you think the IMF might be looking for?
I knew you were going to give me that one, Morris. IMF is looking for conditionality, I suspect. And what needs to be kept in mind is that the IMF steps in when you're in financial crisis, very different to the World Bank, which steps in with development funding. South Africa needs development funding even more than we need IMF funding. IMF funding is going to be short-term, it's going to be conditional. Whether that money comes or not, I don't think our future hinges on that. Our future hinges on the careful and shrewd application of long-term invested capital. It's out of that we will get the spillovers, the multipliers, the linkages, and we can borrow from many other country examples to know how that is done well.
Lovely. Finally, 60 seconds or less, please, Tabi, why are DFIs not able to access their guarantee schemes directly?
I'm not sure if I saw that question in one of the comments, because the DFIs and the guarantee schemes are very different. But I'll comment on the DFIs because I do know that it's largely misunderstood from the funding that we're getting from, let's say, IMF and NDB and the World Bank. It's, the IMF money actually there's the different types of loans. The one that we will be getting, or we are talking to the IMF about, is the low interest rate COVID-19 related funding. It's different from the normal IMF funding that you would get with these when you are at default. And then there are these onerous conditions that you need to fulfill. This one doesn't come with conditions except for it needs to be targeted at COVID-19. It's exactly very similar to the NDB funding that we are receiving, the 1 billion rand funding. So I don't think borrowing is a problem. I actually, in the supplementary budget, we have a chart which looks at the active and passive scenarios where, you know, lending spikes up and then we're highly in debt, and then the other one less so, but we're still in debt. There's good debt and bad debt. Good debt is when you can borrow a lot and then you incur a lot of debt in the short term, but again, you invest that debt or you put it in a place where you can get economic multiplier effect. You pay that debt very quickly, and then you've incurred some growth. You can stimulate growth. Just similar to if I went to the bank and I borrowed a lot of money to start a business, my business is successful, I then can give the bank their money back, and I'm, you know, a millionaire and a billionaire because of the company that I've created off the loan. My problem is that I don't think that South Africa is able to pay back debt very quickly and also utilize that money efficiently. Lastly, I want to say that, you know, Andile is right in that we're not the only country that is heavily indebted right now, and that's a good thing. Brazil has higher a deficit than we do in terms of our emerging market peers, and we are saved by the pandemic because, you know, as Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes out, it is then when you see who's been swimming naked, and that is where the problem will arise. That
Lovely.
when after the pandemic, will we be the naked ones, and will we be the only naked one swimming naked out of a sea of many countries?
Lovely. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Andile. Thank you, Duma. Thank you, Petrus. Thank you, Adrian. And thank you, Tabi. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Please go to
Thank
Slido, answer the question. Was it useful on a scale of 1 to 10? Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.